Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking at the UK's proposed assisted dying bill.
Oh, yeah.
Which, as you know, is always a hot topic. And we're going to be doing a deep dive into it with an article by Edwin Duggan, who is a human rights advocate who's actually been looking at this issue for a really long time.
Oh, wow.
He first wrote about this back in 2007.
Okay.
And this is really interesting because it gives us a chance to see how the debate has evolved.
Right.
And also, if the concerns that were raised back then are still relevant today, and this is especially timely as this bill is headed for parliamentary debate on November 29th, 2024.
Wow. That's coming right up.
It is. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's interesting how some of these core questions, just don't seem to go away.
Right. They're just fundamental questions that we have to keep asking and re-asking.
Yeah, exactly. Like ethically and practically, these issues don't really age.
No, they don't. So before we get into kind of the details of Duggan's perspective, can we just give everyone a quick recap of what this assisted dying bill actually says?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So basically it would allow adults who are terminally ill and who are mentally competent and have been given 6 months or less to live the option to request medical help to end their lives.
So it's not like you just wake up one day and you're like, I'm done, I want to end this. Right. And then the doctor's like, okay, sure, no problem.
No, there's a whole process.
There's a whole process.
Yeah, there are a lot of safeguards in place.
Okay.
Like needing approval from 2 doctors and a high court judge.
So, oh, wow. Okay, so a lot of oversight.
Yeah, to really make sure it's a voluntary and considered decision.
So it's taken very, very seriously.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But, one thing that Duggan seems really concerned about is this idea of the sanctity of life argument.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested to see, how he frames that 15 years later.
Yeah, well, he argues that making assisted dying legal, even with all these strict rules, could send a dangerous message.
Okay.
It could make people think that human life isn't as valuable.
So it's like opening a door that you might not be able to close.
Yeah, like a slippery slope.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And he's not the only one who's worried about that.
I can imagine.
Yeah. It's not just the theory either. He talks about places like the Netherlands and Belgium, where assisted dying has been legal for a while now. And in those places, he points out that the safeguards that were really strict at the beginning have kind of weakened over time.
Oh, wow.
And that's led to more cases and looser rules about who can get it.
So it started as a very narrow window and it's kind of expanded.
Yeah, that's exactly what people mean by a slippery slope. It's hard to know how a law like this will change over time and if those safeguards will actually hold up.
Right. And will people try and push those boundaries?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a little scary.
It is, yeah.
Duggan also talks about coercion as a major concern.
Oh, yeah.
Which kind of suggests that even if there are safeguards, people who are vulnerable could still feel pressured.
Right.
To choose assisted dying.
Right.
So how would that look like in a real life situation?
So imagine, an older person who's really sick and they're worried about being a burden on their family.
Right.
Even if no one actually says, hey, you should do this.
Right.
There's this pressure, a fear of being a drain on them, either financially or emotionally.
Right. And you wouldn't want to put your family through that.
Exactly. And so critics like Duggan are worried that you can't really guarantee true informed consent.
Right. Because there's all these external pressures.
Yeah. Especially for people who are already vulnerable.
It's like being extra vulnerable at a time when you need to make the biggest decision of your life.
Right. It's a really complex issue.
Absolutely. And it's not just a philosophy debate. It has real consequences for people and their families.
Well, for sure.
So beyond those kind of ethical concerns,
right,
Duggan also brings up the practical challenges of actually making this law work.
Right.
He doesn't seem convinced that it can be done safely.
Yeah. He argues that even with the best intentions, it would be incredibly complex to make sure that every case is properly vetted and to prevent abuse. And he keeps using those examples from the Netherlands and Belgium to show how even when safeguards look good on paper,
right,
they can be eroded over time by, legal challenges or changing attitudes in society.
So even if the UK's bill starts with very specific criteria, he's suggesting that those boundaries might not actually stay firm in the long run.
Yeah, he's not saying it'll definitely happen.
Right.
He's saying we need to learn from what's happened in other countries.
Yeah.
And ask, can the UK actually create a system that avoids those unintended consequences?
Right. Learn from their mistakes.
Exactly.
It makes you think about those unintended consequences, not just for the patients, but also for the doctors.
Right.
Like asking a doctor to participate in ending someone's life?
Yeah.
Seems like a whole other ethical can of worms.
Yeah, that's another big point that Duggan makes.
Okay.
Like the traditional role of a doctor is to heal, to preserve life.
Right, to make you better.
Exactly. And so assisting in death, even under very specific circumstances, could seem like it goes against that oath.
Against that fundamental oath.
Yeah. And he worries about, the moral distress that this could put on healthcare providers.
Yeah.
Like they're being forced to make choices that they never thought they'd have to.
It's like a fundamental change, not just to the law, but to like the fabric of the profession.
Absolutely.
And speaking of changes and, unforeseen consequences, we can't really ignore what's happening in Canada right now.
Yeah.
They recently made their assisted dying law even broader to include people who are suffering solely from mental illness.
Oh, wow.
And that seems like it opens up a whole new set of concerns, both ethical and practical.
It definitely does. And this is where Duggan's critique gets even stronger.
Okay.
He argues that people with mental health issues are particularly vulnerable when they're making a decision this big.
Right.
Like he asks, can someone who is in a severe depressive episode truly give informed consent?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, and it puts even more pressure on the healthcare system.
All right. Do we have the resources for this?
Exactly. Do they have the training, the support to handle these complex cases?
And it's not just about the resources, it's about the ethical framework too.
Right.
Like, are we equipped ethically to deal with these kinds of cases?
Yeah, and Canada actually put a 3-year delay on that part of the law because they realized they needed more time to get ready.
That's interesting though.
Yeah.
Because while that delay is meant to protect people, some people are arguing that it's actually violating their rights.
Oh, wow.
Like, if someone meets the criteria and is suffering, shouldn't they have access to assisted dying without having to wait?
Yeah, it's a tough balance.
It is.
And it takes us back to that core question. If the UK passes this bill, could it end up expanding in the same way?
Right. Could we see the UK following the same path as Canada? Widening who's eligible and facing those same complex issues around mental illness and vulnerability.
Exactly.
It's like Duggan's worried that this bill is just the first step on a much longer journey.
Yeah. Yeah. He's definitely urging caution, encouraging lawmakers and the public to think about not just the immediate impact of this bill, but the long-term consequences.
It's like he's saying, let's not make a decision we might regret.
Yeah, exactly.
And he also points out that so many of the concerns that were brought up back in 2005 during the debates on Lord Jouffe's assisted dying bill are still so relevant today.
Yeah, it's like we haven't really learned from the past.
Right. Those same concerns about a slippery slope and the pressure on vulnerable people and the ethical dilemmas for doctors, all still there.
They're not new concerns.
Right.
It's like Duggan saying we need to learn from those past debates and really understand how complex this issue is.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot here. Ethical dilemmas, practical challenges, what's happening in other countries.
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff, but really important. And I just want to pause for a second and ask you, what's resonating with you the most so far? What are your initial thoughts on Duggan's perspective and this whole complex issue of the assisted dying bill?
That's a good question. It is, yeah. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. Yeah, for me, it's those individual choices. That's what really gets to me. Like, we're talking about real people making really tough decisions.
Oh, absolutely.
At the end of their lives. And it's like, how do we balance giving people the right to choose with protecting people who might be vulnerable?
Right. It's such a hard balance to strike.
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk. And Duggan's really good at showing how easy it is to mess up.
Totally. And, that actually brings us to another important point in his article.
Okay.
He doesn't just criticize the bill.
Right.
He makes us think about other options.
Right.
And he really stresses how important good palliative care is.
Yeah.
As a way to help people who are suffering without having to resort to assisted dying.
He's saying that before we even think about making assisted dying legal, we need to make sure that everyone has access to really good end-of-life care.
So instead of focusing on ending life, we should probably make the end of life better.
Exactly, like palliative care can help with pain management, emotional support, and helping people die with dignity even if they can't be cured.
So it's about supporting people all the way through.
Yeah.
Can you maybe explain a bit more about what palliative care actually involves? Like, what does it look like in practice?
Yeah, so palliative care is like a whole person approach to caring for people with serious illnesses.
Okay.
It's not just about physical pain, it's also about their emotional, social, and spiritual needs.
So the whole person, not just their symptoms.
Right. And it involves a whole team of professionals.
Okay.
Like doctors, nurses, social workers, chaplains, who all work together to come up with a plan that's tailored for each individual.
So it's very personalized.
Yeah, and that's where Duggan sees a real missed opportunity.
Okay.
He says that if we put more resources into palliative care, we could probably lessen some of the suffering that makes people consider assisted dying in the first place.
So if people had better pain management, more emotional support, a sense of dignity at the end of life, they might not feel like they need assisted dying.
Yeah, that's what he's arguing. And he's not saying that palliative care is a perfect answer.
Right.
There are always going to be cases where people are suffering terribly, even with the best palliative care.
Right, of course.
But he believes that we should be investing in palliative care anyway, whether or not assisted dying becomes legal.
Right. It should just be a standard of care.
Exactly.
And I can see how that would address some of the reasons why people are suffering in the first place.
Yeah.
If someone feels isolated or abandoned or like a burden on their family, that could definitely influence their choices.
For sure. And Duggan goes even further.
Okay.
He says we need to make bigger changes in society.
Like what kind of changes?
Well, he talks about dealing with the social and psychological aspects of suffering, promoting mental health awareness, and creating communities that are more supportive of elderly people and people with disabilities.
So it's not just about medical care. It's about having a more compassionate and supportive society as a whole.
Right. It's a much bigger conversation.
It is. Yeah, it's a huge shift.
Yeah, but it's a conversation that Duggan thinks is really important.
Okay.
He sees this debate about assisted dying as part of a bigger discussion about how we value life,
Right.
how we take care of vulnerable people, and what kind of society we want to live in.
That's a really powerful way to look at it.
It is.
It goes beyond just the legal and ethical arguments
Yeah.
and makes us think about our own responsibility to make the world a better place for everyone.
I have to say, though, while I really like Duggan's vision,
Yeah.
I still wonder about those people who, even with the best palliative care and all the support in the world, are still suffering terribly.
Right.
Don't they have the right to make their own choices about how their life ends?
Yeah, that's a really tough question.
It is, and that's where this debate gets really difficult.
For sure.
Duggan knows that there are going to be complex cases where people make different choices.
Of course.
He's not saying we should take away anyone's right to choose.
Okay.
He's just saying that we need to be really careful about creating a system that could be abused or lead to unintended consequences.
So it's about finding a balance between individual rights and
Right.
protecting society.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't have to be one or the other.
Right.
We can fight for better end-of-life care, A&D, have open and honest discussions about assisted dying.
So it's not about taking sides.
Right.
It's about having a nuanced and compassionate conversation about a very difficult topic.
Exactly. And I think Duggan's article is a really valuable contribution to that conversation.
Oh, absolutely.
He doesn't have all the answers,
Right.
but he asks important questions and makes us think deeply about what we believe.
He really does. So bringing this back to you, the listener,
Yeah.
why should you care about this? Why is this relevant to your life?
Well, this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate.
Right.
This is about real life decisions that could affect you, your loved ones, your community.
Imagine if your parent or grandparent was terminally ill and in terrible pain. Wouldn't you want to know that they had options, that they didn't have to suffer needlessly?
Yeah, this is about making sure that everyone has access to the best possible care and support, no matter what their situation is.
It's about being informed and understanding the different sides of the argument and forming your own opinion.
Right. This is an issue that touches all of our lives in some way.
And it's not a simple yes or no issue.
Definitely not. There are so many things to consider.
It's not as simple as being for or against assisted dying.
Right.
It's about thinking about all the complexities, having open and honest conversations, and listening to different points of view.
And realizing that there might not even be a right answer.
It's about making the best choices we can in really difficult situations.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to think critically about this, to challenge what we think we know, and to really dig deep.
Yeah, Duggan's article is a great place to start, but it's just the beginning of the conversation.
He gives us a lot to think about, but I think he saves the most thought-provoking question for last.
Really? What's that?
He asks, if assisted dying were legal, where would you draw the line? What conditions would have to be met? What safeguards would you insist on?
Yeah, that is a really powerful question.
Yeah.
You know, it's easy to have a gut reaction to assisted dying, but Duggan really makes us think about it more deeply.
Right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's imagine what if assisted dying was legal here in the UK? What would have to be in place for you to be okay with it?
That's a tough one. But for me, the most important thing is real informed consent.
Okay.
It can't just be about signing a form.
Right.
We have to make sure that anyone making this choice really understands what it means.
Yeah.
Like they've had all the info about their illness, their treatment options and alternatives like palliative care.
And like we were talking about before, how some people might feel pressured even if no one's directly telling them what to do.
Exactly.
So how do we make sure that doesn't happen?
It's tricky, but maybe we need a panel of experts.
Okay.
Not just doctors, but ethicists and mental health professionals who can look at each case individually.
To make sure there's no outside pressure.
Right.
So more than just a couple of signatures.
Yeah, a much more thorough evaluation.
What else would you want to see?
For me, access to high-quality palliative care is a must.
Absolutely.
Everyone facing a life-limiting illness should have the chance to explore pain management, emotional support, and spiritual care before even thinking about assisted dying.
It should be a last resort, not the first option.
Right, exactly. And we need to be really clear about what conditions qualify someone for assisted dying.
Yeah, we keep coming back to that.
Like terminal illness and unbearable suffering are good starting points, but even those terms are kind of vague.
Right. What does unbearable really mean?
Exactly. Like how much suffering is enough to justify this option? It's not a simple question.
No, it's really complicated because what might be unbearable for one person might be manageable for someone else.
Yeah, and pain is subjective, and suffering is more than just physical pain.
Right. There are emotional and spiritual dimensions, too.
Exact, and that's why this whole conversation is so important.
It is.
We need to define these terms clearly and thoughtfully and get input from everyone involved, doctors, ethicists, and most importantly, people who are actually facing these choices themselves.
Right. It needs to be a collaborative effort.
Yeah, bringing all these different voices to the table and having those difficult conversations, even when there aren't easy answers.
It's not about finding the perfect solution. It's about making the best choices we can in really tough situations.
Yeah, and that's where I think Duggan's article is so helpful.
It is.
He doesn't give us simple answers, but he makes us confront the complexity of this issue and figure out where we stand.
He's given us so much to think about, and I think he ends with the most thought-provoking question of all.
Yeah. If assisted dying were legal, where would you draw the line? What conditions would you insist on? What safeguards would you demand?
It's a question we all need to ask ourselves and keep thinking about, so we encourage you to keep reflecting on this issue, keep having those conversations, and thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.